I'll say that privacy, as we might consider it now, has several different components. One component is privacy is you having the right to determine who has access to information about you and your life that is related to you as an individual. Who has access to that information? Whether that's credit information, a list of your family, your medical information, anything about yourself, but you have control over who sees that and under what condition. That's privacy. You may choose to allow anybody to see some of that information, but it's your choice. It's not forced. A second aspect of privacy is the fact of not having things associated with your identity. And it is related somewhat to that first one, but each of us has an identity, at least one identity. Some of us may have more than one, but that identity is usually associated with a name, an identification number, a birth date, and some other personal information. But that identity is unique and it's associated with characteristics. Some of those records that we hold, this personal information, some records that are held by other organizations, such as banking information, billing information, perhaps a record that you've applied for a passport, and other records that are held. So privacy is, again, is limiting that association of name with information and who obtains that mapping. The third kind of privacy governs your ability to conduct transactions. If you know that you're being observed, if someone is watching what you're doing, or you don't know who's watching what you're doing, as often the case with closed-circuit TV or in crowds, you may feel constrained in what you can do. It may alter your inclinations of what you wish to do and how you wish to behave. That is an invasion of your privacy. If that observation or potential for observation causes you to change your behavior from what you wish to do, that is a privacy issue. So I'm going to use those ideas in going forward and talking about some of these things. As I said, this conflict has been around for a long time, but has become much more pronounced with the digital age. For a very long time, our communications were limited to analog mechanisms, and an analog mechanism being handwriting, pictures, sound recordings. Those were the kinds of communications that we depended upon. They also had a tendency to be slow, and it took effort to distribute them widely, and they were usually recorded in such a way that they were consulted as historical information, as data that might be used in retrospect to look at who was born, who was died, where someone lived, who wrote a text, or other information. It was not instantaneous. The information that was obtained in letters, books, church records, those kinds of things, stone tablets, if we go back far enough, was not digital. It was limited to a particular language. It was set down by individuals at the time to record what had happened. And that was, for many, many centuries, the primary goal of communication, was to record what happened. We would consult what happened if we were interested in observing history, or we were trying to get some data to make some conjectures of some kind or another. We would consult these as reference. What happened starting in the 1800s with the invention of the telegraph, really, was communication began to take on a form that was much more immediate. That information could be delivered almost contemporaneous with decisions that were being made. It was possible to have messages back and forth that could affect behavior in real time. That really came to the fore when we started having digital communications starting in about the 1980s that began to tie people together. More use of the telephone, we had computer communications, and we saw a transition begin in the 1800s that really gained a lot of steam in the 1980s and 90s, where instead of collecting information for historical purposes, we now collected and used information to drive decision making. We used information that was coming in to control processes in factories, to control trading in the stock market, to control national defense issues and law enforcement and other kinds of activities where we now depend upon that timely delivery of information. Almost all of it digital. And it drives how we respond, even to the point of having cameras, real-time video cameras, set up on street corners and in businesses where we can real-time dispatch agents of the law or of a company immediately to the site where something is happening. We can use radio to dispatch ambulances and emergency personnel immediately to a point where something is happening. So we're not using information in retrospect now, we're using it to drive what happens. And in fact, we're using it to predict and react before things happen. In real-time control at factories, for example. A very interesting example of this that's quite accessible is before a hurricane hits in the southern United States, Walmart, which has one of the largest data processing centers in the world, will analyze their sales record, they will analyze the weather track, and they will ship truckloads of generators, plywood, drinking water, and other items to areas before the storm even hits. They responded faster than FEMA did during Katrina. They actually had trucks on site with emergency generators and extra water and food before FEMA had even notified field offices. That kind of digital processing and availability of data not only provides an ability to respond to need, in that case, it also provides a very profitable approach that they're able to use that. But having that communications is an advantage. And that's where the issue of surveillance, security, privacy all come together. Where the difference between knowing information and not knowing information provides some kind of power differential, whether it's economic power or the power of the state of enforcement or social power, there is a privacy interest. That's almost always the case. Surveillance is intended to reduce some of that difference or to make it larger. When it's an individual and they're private and that individual's privacy is at stake, it may be to increase the power because social government, other group is conducting the surveillance, and they reduce the ability of the individual to make plans and have behavior independent of the awareness of that larger organization. Privacy we hold dear, at least implicitly, because it does give us that space to operate without concern of who might be watching, without giving up even more of our potential ability to operate as individuals in an economic or social sense. That's why we cherish privacy on an individual versus government basis. We also certainly cherish it in relation to family units and others where we can make plans, where we can do things where other members of our family, our neighborhood, or otherwise are not aware of what's going on, either because we wish to surprise them or we simply don't want them to know for whatever reason we have. Surveillance takes that away. That's why we find many governments, historically as well as currently, who are interested in removing that veil of privacy, of having surveillance of the communications and activities of their citizens and people who are conducting business in those countries, because it increases their power differential of the government versus those individuals. That's the tension that we face, and as I said, it's gotten more profound as we've moved to the point where communications can change the nature of how we behave, that getting information quickly allows us to change things. And one of the best examples of this is what occurred with the Arab Spring a couple of years ago, where simply tweeting from individuals to individuals, using Twitter, using instant messages, allowed crowds to form, not spontaneously, but think flash mob only in a very large sense, clouds to form to protest governments, and some governments fell. It was brought about by the immediacy of the communication. It happened quickly to bring people together, to cause them to pour into town squares, but it was not over a period of time where government could observe those communications and pre-position forces or have forces respond fast enough. That is a wonderful illustration of the difference between the privacy of individuals and of a group versus the surveillance capabilities of government. If that had been observed in enough time, some of those demonstrations probably would not have occurred. Now, from the standpoint of the governments, they wanted that surveillance. Those demonstrations and the fall of the governments were a bad thing. They were against the laws, they were against the social interest. Therein is part of the tension. Under what conditions is surveillance something that should be allowed? That should be something that we, as a population that may be surveilled, should be part of that conversation, should have that discussion. It hasn't really been an item of discussion for us. We have delegated it, and in some cases we're unaware of how much information is being collected and to what extent. Tonight's, at 6 o'clock, the featured speaker in this series, Barton Gellman, is known for many things, but in particular for his coverage of some of the revelations made by Edward Snowden. And if you don't know who Edward Snowden is, then you're keeping everything far too private in terms of your information flow. But that's another, it's an example of a current tension between surveillance and privacy, and security and privacy. That decisions have been made for us, that we have a range of support and a range of opinion as to whether or not those decisions are correct and whether it's been appropriately delegated. And you can find a number of different positions on the role of privacy. Now, it is more interesting as we go forward because we are increasing the amount of digital communication that we engage in, and we are increasing the types of information. Whereas at the time that I was a graduate student, the discussion over computing, a state-of-the-art computer when I was a graduate student, and I know some of my students think that was at the time of coal-fired computers. It wasn't. But when I was a graduate student in the 1980s, an advanced computer system was one that had 64 kilobytes of memory. Okay, 64,000 bytes. That was a lot. We had one of the newest, fastest disks on that system, and it held a whole whopping 80 megabytes of storage. And it was about this big. I'm not going to go through some of the figures to show you the evolution, but as technology has advanced, we have made exponential increases in the amount of memory and storage and communication speed with a corresponding exponential drop in prices. It has now gotten to the point where when talking with people at large businesses, it is cheaper for them to buy new storage rather than pay for the time and energy for someone to go through and delete old information they don't need anymore. Right? So think about that for a moment. We have reached the point where it is more expensive to delete your information, whatever it may be, credit card information, medical information, transaction information of any kind, delete those recordings, for instance, of you going into a store and buying something or walking across campus. It is more expensive to delete that than it is to just go out and buy more storage of whatever form, whether it's a spinning disk or SSD semiconductor memory, and put that online. So we are in an age now where it is cheaper to keep everything that has been recorded, and we're recording more. As we now move into social media, some of you have been there for a while. For instance, on Twitter, everything that goes across Twitter is archived at the Library of Congress. Every tweet you've ever made is available for public view, not only online, but in storage at the Library of Congress. I'm not sure that's necessarily the best thing to archive at the Library of Congress. I certainly know some of my tweets aren't, but it is that nature that we can no longer get away from that material that we post online. Who our friends are, the pictures we post, every one of those cat videos. Those are all out there, and they will be for an indefinite future because that storage isn't going away. How many of you have heard the term big data? Okay, about half. So big data is something that is currently a large research area. Big, large, yes, I guess that's it. But the idea is that we now have so much data, we can't really store it and process it on a single machine anymore. And some of it is coming in so quickly that we have to process it as it's being collected because there's no way to go back retrospectively using current technologies and process it. Why do we want to process it? Oh, there's lots of reasons. Weather data. We want to process that and have up-to-date storm warnings and weather information. Financial information. We want to have the latest for trading stocks. In the area of physics research, some of the experiments with things like the Large Hadron Collider produce so much data that if we don't analyze it and reduce it as it comes in, it would take potentially years to be able to look at it after the fact. Many, many reasons that we want to process the data that may be larger than we can store on an individual system. But a lot of that data is about you. Well, about us. I'm certainly as well represented perhaps as any of you. But our data is out there. It's held by banks. It's held by credit card companies. It's held by medical agencies and government agencies and all kinds of other groups in large part, and there is presumed value in that big data if only we find a way to process it. So for instance, by processing very, very large data sets having to do with medical information, having to do with location information, we may be able to identify patterns of disease resistance, incipient outbreaks of, for instance, flu. We may be able to detect that there is contamination in the air or water and be able to respond appropriately, similar to what Walmart does with a coming hurricane. That could be of great value to us as a society. We may be able to process that information to determine that something is happening in the markets or some change is happening in the economics that we can look at. Potentially, maybe we can process that information to find out about coming earthquakes. All kinds of things have been talked about, as well as discoveries in genomics and large physics and astrophysics and a number of other disciplines. That's all wonderful. But also what's been discussed about that is processing that large information to drive consumerism, to drive profit, so that the large retailers can look at large amounts of information and maybe they determine that after listening to me give a talk somewhere, you all go out and sell all your technology stocks. Well, that could be valuable to someone. Or that you all decide to go out and have a chocolate milkshake. Well, then maybe what they would do if they were able to glean that from the data that they have, and they were able to determine that I will be speaking here, you'd walk out the door and there's somebody with a pile of coupons to drive you to get your chocolate milkshake at a particular vendor. I can suggest Pappy's down in the basement. I'm not associated with them, but I like their milkshakes. That's a predictive kind of use of big data that can result in commercial advantage. Okay, so maybe we are willing to allow that kind of processing. But then we begin to get into territory that becomes a little less comfortable for some of us. So for instance, processing that data to make some prediction of who you might support in a political race and tailoring the information you get about public statements by that individual so that you get news releases or you get positions on things that are tailored for you based on this projection from analyzing all the data about you. Certainly that would be beneficial to those candidates because they would be able to target your specific interests that would be more likely to bring you to the ballot or potentially contribute to the campaign. But on another standpoint, it also means that we may not all be getting the same information. We may not be seeing the totality of views. We may not actually get a good view into the candidates. Although I must say, this year, the more view I get, the more horrified I am. But that's part of the system, is we have choices, and they should be driven by complete information rather than information that is gleaned from the information about what we bought, where we went to school, and other aspects of this big data. Even more troubling to some of us is the idea that to keep us safe, for some definition of safe, is we have government agencies that want to mine that big data. They want to listen to our communications, surveillance. They want to watch what we buy, surveillance. They want to watch who we associate with, surveillance. And using algorithms determine if we have associations or activities that pose a threat, where threat is something they have defined as well. Now, I'm not phrasing this with just the US government. This is being conducted in Russia and China and India and the UK, and pick any other country that has any kind of technological infrastructure. They have an interest in surveilling their citizens against threat, where threat means different things in different locales. Here in the US, one of the threats that is commonly held out is the threat of terrorism. And the idea is spotting terrorists before they strike. That will somehow be able to protect us. It is, however, a case where we are all being watched. All of that information is being collected and run through algorithms without our knowledge. Some of it may not be correct. And what other things are being derived from that information that we don't know about? That should be a concern for every citizen, of every country where the technology is there to provide surveillance is, how do we know who's watching those watchers and what is it that they are actually watching? That's a social tension. That's something that has gotten more profound as time has gone on, as digital technology has gotten more widely circulated. It's possible, in fact it is almost probable, that most countries, most organizations, including businesses surveilling their employees, by the way, to make sure that their employees aren't buying things from Amazon and cruising porn sites on work hours, unlike our students, I didn't mention staff. But that's another area of surveillance where it's an organization looking at the real-time behavior of employees and members and others to determine what they're doing and whether they meet policy. All of those kinds of things are being done without necessarily our understanding that it's being done, our understanding of what happens with that information once it's determined, what else is being looked for, and whether or not we have any say in how that's done. From the aspect of terrorism, think about perhaps a dozen individuals have been caught in the last decade within the US as a result of all of the surveillance, at least that we know of. Independent studies have shown that the number is very small, only a few dozen, and several of those were after the fact and had nothing to do with the surveillance, such as the Boston Marathon bombing was not detected ahead of time, or the cab driver who had the car of explosives at Times Square wasn't detected ahead of time. And yet, all 300 million of us are having our communications surveilled. The National Security Agency just opened a new facility in Utah with storage for yottabytes. I looked that up before I got here. I don't remember how many zeros are in yottabytes. It's really big. Of storage, basically storing phone calls and emails and social media indefinitely from all of us, potentially. We don't know because it's classified. We don't know exactly what's being stored there. But they're not the only government. They're not the only agency. All of that surveillance is being kept by various groups, whether it is in-store anti-theft videos, as well as videos of us at the cash register as we're paying, and that's correlated with credit card records and past purchases and so on. All of that's being stored. Maybe not by everybody, but by enough that we are leaving this permanent imprint that will be around years after we are gone. The surveillance has become pervasive. Whereas it used to be you could arrange to meet someone clandestinely in a location that was not observed, where you could send a letter that, so long as the wax seal wasn't broken, so long as no other person got the letter and understood the code, you had high confidence that message was not read. We have had this change. And this change has largely been over the last 100 years. It hasn't been a gradual change. It hasn't been something that we as a society have been able to collectively decide how best to do this or under what conditions. It has largely occurred because of the incredible pace of technology. And consistent with the idea of the dawn or doom, because we are here now, and what does that mean? But going forward, here's another term. How many of you have seen the phrase or heard the term IoT? Okay, a smaller number. IoT, we love acronyms, is Internet of Things. The Internet of Things are things that you are beginning to get now, where your car has an internet hotspot. By 2017, it will be required that all new cars are networked to talk to each other. Maybe not to the internet, but they have to be able to communicate back and forth. It's intended, at least it was sold as a safety mechanism. It's also going to be used for commercial purposes. So if you're driving down the road, there may be a message from cars that are stopped up ahead for a wreck, but you'll also probably be getting messages from the billboard at the side of the road that if you pull off now, you can get 15% off on your purchase. It's hard to prevent spam anywhere once you've got communications in place. But your car will be online and communicating. Your refrigerators, your stereo systems, all of those will be connected and will be communicating and leaving a footprint for you of some kind in the digital world. Right now we have things called RFID tags, radio frequency ID tags, and proximity tags. If you've got a passport, you've got one in it. At a lot of retailers, if you buy anything, including clothing, they actually have an RFID tag built in for inventory purposes. Some pharmaceutical cartons have RFIDs built in so that they can track and make sure that you don't get counterfeit pharmaceuticals. All good uses. But those same tags can be read to match up purchases and items with you as an individual. It is getting to the point where when our home appliances and our clothing is snitching on us, gossiping about us. I don't want my refrigerator gossiping about me. It'll say very bad things. The image that's possible with big data, the image and the footprint we're going to leave online is so large, surveillance will not be conducted by individuals so much anymore as by our appliances and our car and our clothing. We're on the verge of that right now. Where have you seen discussion of this? Where have you seen any of our elected representatives talking about this? Where have you seen this discussed by the merchants who are including these? Other than perhaps in the very fine print on the 19-page agreement that you click through and don't read when you visit their site online. There hasn't been a discussion about this change in technology. Every one of the things that I've mentioned has either a convenience and economic factor or a security factor that is used to justify why it's done. So for instance, putting those RFID tags in pharmaceuticals helps prevent counterfeit pharmaceuticals from getting into the supply chain. And for any of us here who are on a medicine that we're taking for a chronic problem, that's important. You don't want your antibiotic pills to actually be stuffed with powdered sugar. You don't want your beta blocker for your cardiac condition to actually include caffeine as filler. And these are the kinds of things that have occurred because in many places in the world they can make a quick buck by putting in inert substances and counterfeiting the packaging. There's a big business in that. So putting RFID tags in provides something for the safety of the consumers, but it adds a layer of surveillance that hasn't been discussed. Putting RFID tags in clothing means that the big retailers can do inventory by just walking up and down the aisles with a scanner. They don't even have to stop and count things. They just walk up and down and read the RFID signal into a computer, and in 15 minutes they have an inventory of everything in the store. I used to do a summer job at a plumbing supply place where I would help inventory everything they had in the warehouse. I'm so glad I got my degree. But that would take a team of 5 of us a week to go through the warehouse, where now it could be done by somebody in 10 minutes. Think about the savings involved and the accuracy change, because I must admit at a certain point, about 2 in the afternoon, our counting got a little questionable. But the increased accuracy and the fidelity of being able to do this kind of inventory control is billed as a benefit because it gets passed along to you in lower prices, greater accuracy for the vendors. And of course, the other kinds of surveillance that are being conducted, your appliances, for instance, that are connected up, the argument there is it reduces your energy costs, saves you money, it helps reduce greenhouse gases, and may actually make some of your appliances work better. So that, for instance, your air conditioning doesn't need to turn on until an hour before you arrive home, because as you leave work, your desk chair communicates with the network, and it checks with your car to see if you start your car up within 10 minutes and where your car is. And if you've started your route home, then your air conditioning kicks up a level because it's been in communication with the weather service and knows how warm it is outside, and it knows your personal preferences. Okay, well, gee, that's convenient. That's like having somebody show up with a bagel and or a cup of coffee and a donut when I wake up. But it also means that it has to track where you are, where you've been, what your usual route is. So the surveillance that is conducted there is presumably by your own devices, but it can also be monitored by others. Where has that been discussed? Where has someone said, you as a consumer have these benefits, are you willing to give up privacy? Are you willing to give up that much privacy? Are you willing to give up that much information in return for the benefits? Now, before you answer that, think what I said earlier when I was starting off and I said it's now cheaper to buy new storage than it is to delete old information. So not only are you giving up the privacy tomorrow for what you may do, but you're also giving up potentially any future interest in having that information forgotten. Okay, so let me mention two things in the news where discussion has come up. And I don't know if you followed it, but we're beginning to see a little bit of awareness and pushback on some of this. And I encourage you to think about it and start paying attention to some of this discussion, because it affects each of us, and it affects our next generation, it affects our businesses, because each decision we make, each step forward we take, results in information going out into storage that we cannot get back. The two things that have come forward here in recent months and years, really the last few months, related to this. The first is, in Europe, the European rules for privacy and ownership of data are a little bit potentially more consumer-friendly than they are here, or in places like Russia or China or other places. In the European Union, data about you belongs to you. Here, in the United States, data about us belongs to whoever collects it. So if you go to the store and there's a little slip about enter the sweepstakes and you put in your name and address and phone number, that information now belongs to whoever collected that. It doesn't mean you lose interest in it. They can't take it away from you, but it means that they can use it without your permission. Whereas in Europe, if they collect that information about you, once they get above, I think it's 20 entries in a database, they've got to ask your permission. They've got to notify you that they've got it and ask you if they can use it. Well, one of the things that has come up there in the law is the right to be forgotten. And the intent there is that if there is a story about you that has been published that is prejudicial to you and is no longer applicable to current interests, it should be erased if you ask for it. So we have people who had news stories that were prejudicial to them in some way from 10 years ago or 20 years ago, going to the newspapers and going to Google and demanding that those entries be removed from their databases. It reduces the potential surveillance capability of someone to look up their history. Now, it's not removed necessarily from government databases, but it is removed from consumer-facing and commercial-facing databases. So for us to surveil someone is limited. It enhances the privacy of the individual. But it does so at a cost of information and our ability to get an accurate picture. In Europe, that's been judged to be worth the trade-off. I don't know how we feel. I think if we went around the room, we would find a variety of different attitudes, including mostly, I haven't thought about it yet. But that's an interesting change. Imagine if you wanted to go look something up in Wikipedia. Well, you can't trust that. You went to the library and you tried to look something up, and in every book where there should have been an entry for that, there's a hole cut out. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? It has to do with this balance between privacy and surveillance. Here's the second one. We've had a number of government officials, including James Comey, the director of the FBI, who have made public statements about how vendors, such as Google and Apple and Microsoft, putting strong encryption in their products so that law enforcement can no longer decrypt and read people's messages and email. The argument being made by law enforcement is this will allow the criminals to conspire without law enforcement being able to detect it. Whereas from the companies, the standpoint is it's not their job to enable law enforcement to snoop on people's information. And in fact, for anyone who is technically savvy, he or she could easily get encryption programs independent of what the vendors are providing. There's a big issue of public policy. Some countries prohibit encryption entirely, or they require that the keys be deposited with a government agency. In some countries, it's actually criminal if you try to send encrypted communication. What should it be? At what point should we say the interests of privacy against surveillance by government agencies and law enforcement for the whole population, as well as the protection against criminal elements, is worth more than the ability of law enforcement to find particular people with malintent? I don't have an answer. This is an evolving area, and it's not something that even my answer would be appropriate, because that would be just my answer. This is something that we as a community, as a public, need to be able to have some sense of where the lines are, what we should allow. How much of our privacy are we willing to give up for the public good, for the economic good, for law enforcement, and social order, versus how much independence should we have? How much freedom to not change our actions should we have? I'm going to leave you with that thought. There's a very large body of literature on privacy and surveillance. I don't have a handout. If you have difficulty finding something that you think would be interesting, if you drop me an email, I can recommend a couple references. But I think it's worth thinking about, and I would encourage you to go listen to the talk at 6 o'clock today in Fowler Hall, or not Fowler, it's Loeb Playhouse, right? By Barton Gilman. I'm not sure what he's going to say, but I'm sure it will be interesting. And in the 10 minutes or so here that we have left, I would also welcome, if any of you want to ask a question, I'll try and answer it. But you have to come up and use the mic because they want to capture it for the video. And so there goes your privacy by coming up and asking the question. So come on up. Come on up and... They'll get the back of your head on camera, so maybe it's not totally giving up your privacy. It's gorgeous. Thank you.
So in the context of the right to be forgotten,
Okay.
So in the context of the right to be forgotten you're talking about, I would question what's the more realistic policy, because how many defectors does it take, for instance, someone who moves out of the jurisdiction of the EU to archive or record these, to where you basically have to disconnect the network at all by rather extreme firewalling or something to remove all references or links, even indirectly, back to the archive sources outside of that. So of the two policies, of which the United States is like, whatever, versus the EU being very cautious about this, what's the more realistic policy in the long run?
It's a very good question. And realism in that sense is what's socially acceptable, what's legal to do, and when you're crossing jurisdictional boundaries, it gets very difficult because what is accepted policy in Europe is not necessarily accepted here. which anybody who's traveled in Europe will quickly discover. In that case, the right to be forgotten, what they're now requiring Google to do, and it'll be very interesting to see if this works, is the French courts are telling them that any query made from France to U.S. servers also have to be blocked.
Right,
and that's not clear that that's going to even be enforceable.
Yeah, and that might work for like the major companies where you have like basically pressure points. You can do that too, but that's not to stop someone to save the Caribbean from starting up their own like small service to do this, right?
That's right, and that's something that, again, as a society, we haven't come to grips with. Is where do we draw the lines? What is socially acceptable? What are we going to tolerate legally? But we have the same problem with banking systems. So.
Are there any metrics, by the way, so far to see how well that policy has?
No.
No, okay.
No metrics.
All right, thank you.
It's new. Thanks. Hello.
Okay, what kind of laws are already in place to protect our privacy as an individual?
Here in the U.S.?
Yes.
There are some laws in place that aren't very strong at a federal level. There are requirements, for instance, that if a government agency asks you for your information on a tax form or otherwise, they're supposed to state where in the law that's required or requested. But there aren't a lot of other places where that's the case. One of the strongest laws is actually protecting, you're too young for this, but for those of us who would ever rent videotapes, one of the strongest privacy laws was protecting the records there, because during a Senate hearing, to confirm a Supreme Court justice, someone got a copy of the videotapes that he had rented, and that came out in testimony, and that scared a number of senators, so they introduced a bill to... So that's some of the strongest protection. Medical records as well, there's something called the HIPAA Act that protects your medical information, sort of. Anytime you go to a medical provider, they give you the privacy practices, and you have to sign it. But basically what you're agreeing is if you want to be reimbursed by your insurance company, they should be able to give it to anyone. So there aren't a lot of privacy laws that are in place, and that's unfortunate. But it's to enable business and government to operate.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Hello.
Hi, Dr. Spaff. Thanks for coming here and talk to us. So I came from China, and increasingly I have noticed both here and in my country, because of the evolution of social media, there are an increasing number of people who are saying things that is not, they don't think they can be held responsible for what they are saying, and also they turn to be more negative and aggressive when they are expressing their informations and opinions online. So in your opinion, because of the evolution of technology and media, and because of this trend, is there some kind of regulation should be placed for the online communication, or should that be a right or a privacy that people should enjoy?
That's a wonderful question with a lot of nuance to it. And I agree, and I think any of us who've been online, the very negative and very strongly worded attacks that sometimes come about, particularly women online, get an awful lot of abuse at a much higher level than some of the rest of us do. And I get my share of abuse. I can't imagine what some of it is like. Is a real problem. And as you say, there is a certain level of anonymity. So there isn't the surveillance. It's done under pseudonyms, and that lets some people think they can get away with it. We have little recourse. Part of the problem there, I think, is not so much regulation as it is social. We don't speak out enough about bad behavior. And that's something I would encourage all of us to do. We would tend to be much more forthright if we saw violent behavior out on the street. We might report it. We might even step in, some of us. Online, we tend to tolerate that or let it go. And we have to change that form. what you're describing is a different kind of trade-off between free speech and civility. We impose certain kinds of civil behavior. China here, otherwise, it is against the law to commit assault in person, and we don't necessarily have caught up yet for the online world. And there is that question of how much free speech, what is disruptive, what is not, what is hate speech, what is not, that haven't been fully addressed, that are also evolving. Maybe that's a talk I can do for this next year. Or you can take one of my classes. But I don't have a simple answer for it. There's a lot of nuance to that. There's a lot of compound issues that are involved. But I would say the first and biggest thing is we have to have more of a social pressure. We have to develop a new set of manners and etiquette. And part of that is if someone does something impolite, not necessarily illegal, but they do something impolite, the rest of us will frown at that person, or will scold them, or will avoid them. We don't do that online enough. We need to get into that to help try and reinforce the behaviors we want. The same is true in society. All of these things are happening incrementally. Unless we step forward and indicate where we draw lines, people will continue to push against them. And with that, a line I can't push against is the end of the session, because we have a room monitor who will cut off my mic and carry me away. Thank you very much for coming and listening, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the program.